our meeting as we traditionally do with a moment of silence. Please join me in that. Thank you. Let's stand and let's say the flag. Allegiance to the flag.
To the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We have only one item on the agenda this evening for the public portion of the meeting, and that is the budget workshop. And at this point, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Mr. Lawrence and Mr. Trent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. At this time, I'll ask our Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Traxler, to come to the podium.
Good evening, Dr. Bradley, Mr. Lawrence, board members. We've been working now for a few months on the budget. It hasn't been as obvious because a lot of it's been behind the scenes. But hopefully we'll give a good preview tonight of next week's first reading of the budget. Give you an opportunity to answer or ask any questions, us to answer any, or consider some other things that maybe aren't reflected in here. I think each of you has a copy of tonight's presentation. We have some additional info there as well. Real informal, so of course, ask any questions at any point. We'll be happy to do our best to answer. I like to start every year by showing the district's budget timeline. We have a board policy that requires that we adopt a budget calendar every year by November 1st, and this board adopted one in October. It's not everything that takes place in the budget, but it gives a broad overview, and it does identify some key dates there. In years past, we would have a budget work study in mid-March, and we found that typically we didn't have a whole lot of concrete numbers. It's early in the state's budget process, and a lot of it was general info. And about 3 years ago, I think, we decided to have this budget work study in mid-April. We had already done it on occasion, but it gives us an opportunity to get some numbers from the state and reflect that and have a better idea of where things stand. So that's worked out well for us. We have the first reading of the budget next week. We have a budget hearing on May 11th, and then the second reading of the budget, which is the final reading, scheduled for May 25th. We used to have 3 readings of the budget. It typically went at the last Tuesday in June, but a few years back now, we determined that it best fit our needs to have 2 readings and finalize our budget in late May. It also coincided with the state finalizing their budget a little bit sooner, and with twice-a-month paychecks and our need to get things finalized in order to the paycheck. Just as important as our timeline is the state's timeline. About half of our operating budget comes from the state. That's a chunk of it in the general fund, but we also have our EIA funds. We have state grant monies. This year has been trending probably a week to 2 weeks later than typical for the state. Key dates here early and into late March, the House Ways and Means and the House were working on their versions of the budget. So our revenue numbers that you'll see tonight are based on that, and that you'll see next week, unless we have some updated numbers out of the Senate Finance. This week, the Senate Finance Committee is meeting on the budget, full Senate in late April, and they end their session in mid-May. Throughout the budget process, and I'm sure that board members see it regularly, School Boards Association provides updates, sometimes quick hitter daily updates on some of the budget processes. We receive weekly updates from SCASBO, the Association of School Business Officials. There are other groups that put out regular updates throughout the process. So it's fluid, moving target. We're adjusting things consistently. One thing you may not be aware of is that things get proposed at the state level, and our State Department of Ed will send an email a lot of times. We had to submit one today where they request a fiscal impact statement. Hey, here's some proposed legislation. What might the impact be on your school district? What do you foresee? In those situations, we'll share it with senior staff. Some things are fairly obvious, really not a significant cost to it, if any. There are other things that may be proposed that could have significant cost, and we want to share that with the state, and ultimately those things are shared with state legislators. I don't know that I mentioned it yet, but typically as each budget version is passed, about 2 or 3 weeks later, the State Department of Ed will put out, all right, this is what this version of the budget means to Aiken's allocation. So we hear what happened in early March for the House Ways and Means, but within a couple weeks of that, the State Department publishes things that shows every school district and what the projected allocations are based on those decisions. I think most everyone has seen this slide before. It's the different funds that we have. That red bucket's local. We'll bring a budget proposal next week, including everything except for that red bucket that's handled at the school level. But our largest fund is the general fund, and this discussion tonight focuses on the general fund, as does most of our budget discussion. We've talked about must items in the past. So those are items that we don't have a lot of control over, we don't have a lot of discretion over. Maybe board's already decided that we're going to implement X during the coming year. We're going to phase in something over several years. These are items that we look at first. What do we have to do? What do we have to get into the budget? Every year, our starting step is going to be based on student enrollment projections and school staffing allocations. In our general fund, about 90% of the budget is tied to salaries and fringe costs. So anytime we do anything with the budget, if there are step increases, if there are cost of living adjustments, it has a huge impact. You look at the other 10% in the general fund budget, it's going to be made up of things like supplies and travel and energy costs, but salaries are the highest impact. So we spend a lot of time on student projections and a lot of time on school staffing allocations. For salaries, I have this underlined here. I know of one recent exception, but the state will require a step increase for teachers. The one exception that we dealt with was last spring when the state froze the teacher scale and then came back about a month or so ago and said, all right, we're going to reinstitute that, and we want to pay lump sum mid-year by June 15th, so we're working on that now. Every year we can count on the state requiring us to give teachers a step increase when they're eligible. A lot of years there's a cost of living adjustment that we have to take into account. We're required to. We've also, at least historically in recent years, over the last 7 or so years, had consistent handling for non-teachers. So if an increase, if cost of living adjustment or a step increase was approved for non-teachers, we handled, or for teachers, we handled the non-teachers the same. State retirement is one of those items that we have no discretion over. We participate in the state retirement plan. They set every year what the increase is going to be for employers. We have to build that into the budget. We're part of state health. We have to build that into the budget. This next item is something that we've had to budget for historically. It's coming off the list next year, but I will touch on that on another slide, and then other obligations and decisions. So again, those are things that maybe the board has said that we're going to build into the budget, or we're in the process of phasing in. We already have that obligation here. The year that we're in, and the year going forward at least, enrollment, as it does in any year, is going to be key. But what we're dealing with currently, and as we've discussed in the past, is a decrease in enrollment. If you look back 10 years, 20 years, Aiken has always hovered kind of at that same level. This slide shows back to the 11-12 school year. You don't see much movement in that line until we get to this past year. The impacts of COVID this year on enrollment had a significant impact on a lot of our revenues, a lot of our allocations. The year that we're in, we didn't have that crystal ball that said, hey, we're going to be down X number of students because of COVID for whatever reason. Maybe they were homeschooled, maybe they're at, they moved away, the family moved away for whatever reason. This upcoming year, we do have the advantage of better planning for the reduced enrollment. We also have the hope that those numbers return to the norm here in the very near future. So our budget reflects that. I do want to point out that this slide, I pulled out charter school numbers and I pulled out 4K. I want to make sure that we were looking at apples to apples. So that's just our K-12 students based on ADM since the 2012 school year. All right, before I leave this slide, one other thing I want to mention. So we've talked about projections, enrollment projections. They're extremely important because if you over project significantly, that means that we've staffed schools up here instead of down here. More teachers than what we need, more aides than what we need. It has a tremendous impact on the budget. And then too few students that are bringing in the revenues to support our instructional programs. It's not a good combo. So we want to be real careful on those enrollment numbers. Whenever we project for an upcoming year, we're looking not only at what this year's numbers are, but also feeder patterns, birth rates, historically, what we've seen happen at this school or that school. Is there a new neighborhood that's going up next to a school? Those things are taken into account. It's not a perfect science, but we want to be as close as possible. This next slide just shows the pupil-teacher ratios. One of the superintendent's goals for this, Mr. Lawrence's goals for this upcoming year and looking forward are to reduce pupil-teacher ratios at the elementary level. Excuse me. So this shows that for this version of the budget, in the version that we're presenting next week, we have reduced first grade, fourth grade, and fifth grade by 2 students per grade. First grade going from 18 to 1 to 16 to 1. Fourth and fifth going from 25 to 1 to 23 to 1. Whenever we look at allocations and try to determine how many teachers we need at this school in this grade, the numbers aren't going to work out perfectly. And in kindergarten, you aren't always going to have 50, 75, or 100 kindergartners. So whenever we analyze, we look at things with a +2 or -2 range. So ideally in second or third grade, if we're at a 23.5 class average across 5 classes in the grade, typically that's going to be good. We'll live with that. If something is pushing an average of 25 in second or third grade, or even a little bit higher, that tells us we have a need to, in all likelihood, to add additional teachers. We have 8 FTE for our highest priority schools that these 8 schools get 8 additional FTE and are using them for lowered class sizes in first or second grade. That's at the principal's discretion. We also have schools that utilize Title I funds for class size reductions as well. So those aren't reflected up here, but that's something that happens with regularity. Each year we set the original allocation for schools based on projections, and we do that in February. We'll do it in March for middle schools and high schools. But that's not the end of the process. We'll continue to watch things throughout the spring, throughout registration. Spend a lot of time early in the school year to make sure class sizes are where they need to be. We'll look at class sizes to see, all right, do we have within this school, our class sizes in this grade at the level that we want? If not, maybe there's another grade that is understaffed or overstaffed, and we may have internal shifts within the schools. Sometimes we may have shifts between schools. We don't want to add FTE needlessly. We want to make the best use of the resources that we have available. So this slide shows the results from our allocation meetings that we've had so far this spring. You'll see just bottom line there that the number of Fund 1 teachers are down sharply, but enrollment's down. So that's why. A large majority of them, well, the majority of them are at elementary, substantial number at middle, and then high. Whenever we look at allocations for elementary schools, we typically meet as a group in a large room with all of the elementary principals. It's pretty easy to see those, what the average class sizes are projected to be, and we have a pretty clean formula, typically going around the room and last about an hour. Our meetings with middle school and high school principals are a little more intense. One-on-one meetings, we'll have members of senior staff there, HR, some other folks. We'll have folks from the school there, the executive director from that level, and we'll look at course requests for the middle school and course requests for the high school to see if based on an initial formula and an initial estimate of the number of teachers, if we're right on, or if we need to add some more teachers, or or if we need to, if we have the ability to reduce the number of teachers, if we may be able to collapse some sections that are offered that don't have a whole lot of interest, things of that nature. So we'll spend 45 minutes or an hour at each of those and go through course requests. Based on those discussions, middle was down just short of 21 FTE, high school was about the same. These allocations don't include special ed, Title I, some of those other allocations there. So these are largely the Fund 1 allocations. So this first reading of the budget, with a lot of the focus on salaries and positions, the proposed version pending tonight's discussion includes a step increase for eligible teachers. Again, that's required, and there are some other groups of employees that the state says you had to give a step increase to. School psychologists, OTs, PTs, nurses, and maybe one or two others, ROTC instructors are included in that group, or we're required to. There's been a focus, one of the goals is to add steps to the top of the teacher scale and ultimately get it to a 28-step scale. That would align better with when teachers are retirement eligible. A few weeks ago, the board approved the mid-year step for 2021. That was retro to the start of the year, and at that time, increased the scale from step 24 to step 25. This budget goes one step further, bumping it from 25 to step 26. We've included the step increase for non-teachers here. Again, that's something that over the last several years, the board has made the effort to treat all employees the same. Whatever's approved as a cost of living adjustment or a step increase, to do that for all employees. We had a 6-year stretch beginning in about 2008 where non-teachers didn't receive a step increase, and it pretty much created a mess. And if you could think about it, suppose that you had an aide or a secretary that started in 2008 and they went a 6-year stretch without getting a step increase. And there might have been a little cost of living adjustments along the way, but they got to 2012 or 2013 and they're still at step 0 and they have 5 or 6 years of experience. Well, you have someone else hired in that has not a lick of experience, and they're starting out at step 0, the same step. It just created a mess. It created a backlog. Luckily, we've been able to avoid that over the last several years. The budget doesn't include a cost of living adjustment. There's not one currently required at the state level, and we haven't reflected one here. We did have the question at our March 23rd meeting about the handling of the mid-year step, and I indicated that we would have to dip into fund balance, and there was concern that salaries are always recurring, and you've told us and reminded us constantly that we don't want to hit fund balance for recurring items. But at the time, I said our plan is to build it into the budget going forward, so it really would be non-recurring as I hit the fund balance, and we would build it into the budget. So that's just a reminder there that is taking place. Just FYI, step increase for eligible teachers typically averages about 2%. So 2% for hourly employees, 1.5% for most of the salary scale employees who are eligible for a step. lot of folks may not be familiar with our teacher salary schedule, so I thought I'd put it up here. It's not the entire thing, of course. It was either to cut part of it off or have it where you could see it. So I chose to have it where you could see it. But I did want to point out those first few steps. We've talked about the pay band before. So you see that from step 0 to 3 here, for each degree level, the numbers are the same, the salary's the same. In years where there's a cost of living adjustment, if there was a 2% cost of living adjustment, for example, this year, we would up that and up all of these by 2%. Kind of hides it, it kind of hides that there isn't an increase in a given year associated with the step increase. In the year where there isn't a cost of living adjustment, you may have a teacher that's at step 0. They move up to step 1, but it's not associated with a step increase. So hopefully this helps visualize that a little bit. Once someone's at step 3, they qualify for a step 4, they see that increase. And again, our salary schedule for 1920 cut off here with the mid-year step and with 2% step increments along the way. The board approved the 25th step, and we're asking in this budget proposal for the board to approve a 26th step. And we built that in just for reference too. I looked to see how many teachers were topped out at step 25 and would advance to step 26. If that's approved, there are 182 teachers. So we have almost 10% of our teachers that were at the top of the scale, and would continue to move up as long as they remain with us, as we hope to add steps to this teacher's scale in future years. All right, state retirement. So that's another item that we don't have discretion over. I know this shows the retirement contributions for employers for the year we're in now. They haven't published it for this next year. So this is the latest info we have. We know that, and there are several components to this. All of this totals up to 21.81%. So that's, in essence, we're paying 21.81% of every dollar, every $100, every $1 million to the retirement system. We know that this is going up 1%, so at the very best, we know that the retirement contribution next year is going to be 22.81%. This number here is a little bit of a wild card. A lot of times we don't hear what that's going to be until maybe June. So we're estimating right now for a little bit of an increase. It typically does go up. So I've budgeted for 23% retirement for next year. If we hear that changes, we'll update our estimates accordingly. Just so you can see historically, and there's a very faint trend line there, but in 11-12, state retirement was in the around 14%. For those that are familiar, the state retirement, it was underfunded by billions and billions and billions of dollars. So the plan was put in place that over a series of years, the retirement would step up 1% per year. In each of these years, there were small increases, but here is really where you see the 1% per year. Whenever you add in those insurance supplements, the little wild card thing, we're probably going to end up over 24%, I would say, by the mid-2020s or more. So again, putting it in perspective for this next year, I'm using 23% for retirement. It was 21.81%. If we had no change whatsoever and we had $100 million in salaries, we would have paid in the year we're in 21.81 million in retirement. And just by that rate going up, we're paying 23 million. So 1.2 million increase. That has a significant impact on the budget, just that rate increase on retirement. Of course, we have a lot of salaries that applies to, and that applies to salaries outside of Fund 1 as well. You know, some other pots that may not be growing, but with step increases with retirement and those costs, we always have to keep that in consideration as well. State health, I don't know, it's not quite as bad as the title sounds there. It's not real bad by health standards, but this is really more good news. The state has projected the increase to be 0.8% for health insurance next year. They typically don't finalize that until August after we finalized our budget, but oftentimes this time of year we'll get a newsletter or an email that says, hey, we think that you could plan on X%. And that's what we base the budget on this year. Those health insurance increases go into effect mid-year, so really instead of a 0.8% increase over the course of the year, if you were looking at it that way, it's 0.4%. But the good news is last year this time we received a newsletter that said that we think that health insurance is going up 6.73%, and it didn't. But we built our budget based on that, so, and it's still in the budget. So even though health insurance premiums are actually going up 8%, we over budgeted it for the year we're in. We're able to pull back some on that health insurance budget. It benefits us this year by several $100,000 just based on that. It doesn't impact our budget, but there was a note that there aren't expected to be any changes for employees. So employee premiums and co-pays we think will remain the same. So that's worth mentioning as well. So I had the charter school listed early on one of the slides, and it was marked through. We used to have 3 charter schools. Last year we had 2. One of those went to an alternate sponsorship. This year in 2021 we have 1 charter school that's district sponsored. Next year we'll have 0. Charter school allocations are based on a formula in the general fund. And for our lone remaining charter school for this year, we budgeted almost $661,000. So we won't have to budget an allocation for charter schools next year because we'll no longer have a district-sponsored charter school. You'll see that line item with a 0 there. And next year it'll be totally off the budget. I wanted to shift gears a little bit. We've talked about enrollment and the impact that it had on staffing, but it has a great impact on a lot of our state revenue allocations. It impacted us in the year that we're in. It's going to impact us next year too, it appears. The largest state allocation is our Efa Allocation, the Education Finance Act. We went into this year thinking that we would get almost $57 million. Our projection for next year is about 53.8 million for the decrease in enrollment. Now, if enrollment numbers come in high, then the state's going to adjust that. They base an original estimate for the year on the current year's 135-day numbers, or the previous year, I guess. And as we progress through the year, once we hit the 45-day mark, they'll update the allocation based on the 45th day ADM, and then they'll have a final revision based on the 135th day ADM. The fringe and retirement allocation from the state, we're looking at it being down 700,000+ from the original budget. We're looking at our reading coach allocation being down 274,000 from what we originally budgeted in 2021. Our at-risk budget being down about 55,000. We have some allocations that are up. They're not tied directly to enrollment numbers, or as tied to them. They may be tied to something else, like I think our bus driver allocation is tied to miles driven. So there are a variety of formulas that the state uses for its multitudes of pots of funding. So some aren't as impacted by enrollment. As I said earlier, this is based on the House version, but a lot of times the Senate has the advantage of having the latest revenue info from the state. So there's always some hope that maybe the Senate gets good news whenever they receive some revenue updates, as they're working through their process, and maybe some additional funds can be made available. We'll continue to monitor that. We don't know if that'll happen at this time, but of course we'll share and update things if it does happen. We should certainly know before the second and final reading of the budget if there are any changes that need to be made in that. I think anyone that's been on board has seen this slide, and I typically share with new board members too whenever we've had a chance for a Budget 101 session, but it's worth sharing every year. I think the blue line is where our base student costs should be funded per state law. Red line is where the state has funded it. You'll see that there were periods up through about 2008 where there were overlaps of those lines. That meant that base student costs was being funded by the state where it should, and then the bottom fell out of the economy, and we still haven't recovered. For this upcoming year, the projected ideal base student cost is $3,140. We're looking at least, based on the House version of the budget, at $2,500 for base student costs. Which may not sound like a lot, but you think about, all right, 600 times 20,000 students, 22,000 students. That gap right there is about $14 million annually for us. So it does have a significant impact. This next slide aligns closely to that, and I'm looking at a shortened period. It's our EFA allocation. Our EFA allocation's based on three things. You have your base student cost, which we just showed. You have enrollment, and we have the index of tax-paying ability. So it's a measure of our district's wealth compared to all other districts in the state. It's really just every year they look at the pie and they say, all right, Aiken's richer in comparison to everybody else, or poorer in comparison to everybody else. from a year ago. And those numbers are updated every year, and it goes into this formula. So on that last slide, we saw that big dip where base student costs fell. Things have been improving, and we might expect, because our enrollment has historically been pretty level, for this to level off. But you see this dip here, despite the slight increase in base student costs because of our drop in enrollment. So look where we were in '08, we were at 57 million, which is barely recovered to that level last year. Now, we're projecting about 53 million and change for our Efa allocation. Again, that allocation is going to be updated at different checkpoints. You have an original number, it's updated for the 45th day numbers during the year, and then for the 135th day numbers. I hope this one isn't too small for folks, but it's a draft snapshot of the general fund revenue budget that we'll be bringing forward next week, again, pending any discussions. We show our local revenues up top. Those are our property tax numbers. We have delinquent taxes. We have payments in lieu of tax, tuition, interest, other local. The largest line item here are the property tax, current property tax revenue. We've estimated an increase there. Historically, we've budgeted conservatively there. And historically, we've seen nice growth every year. So we've taken that into account with this budget. It does not reflect a millage increase. So this is just growth in the tax base based on what we've seen in the past, what we're seeing this year, what we anticipate next year. Delinquent taxes, payments in lieu of tax, we bump those up based on recent trends. As you look at the bottom part of the page, those are state allocations. You'll see some reductions there for the things that we just discussed, tied to enrollment. This is one of those state allocations that's not tied to enrollment. That's our Act 388 allocation from the state. It typically goes up. This is the statewide penny sales tax that replaced the school operating millage on primary residences. I think it's tied to CPI, maybe population growth. We typically see an increase in that number. We receive that in 1/10 installments beginning in October of every year. Most years that increase is 600, 700,000, 500,000. So that's why we have an increase there. That increase is based on the trend. I do want to point out this number here. So for those that were on the board last year, you may remember we really had a bare bones budget. We couldn't provide a step increase to teachers, and we brought a first reading and ultimately a final budget where revenues exceeded expenditures, and we knew that at some point we were likely going to hit that because we anticipated that the state may do something during September and ultimately they did it during mid-year with the staff increase. But last year was a year where revenues exceeded expenditures whenever we got everything into the budget that we needed to. This year was a little different. It was the flip of that. And as we've done in the past, to get things balanced, I have us flexing EIA funds. We have some EIA funds to help us balance the budget. A chunk of this is at-risk money that we're already having to flex to pay for the Excel program. That's a decision that the board made a year ago to create that program, and our at-risk funds can't be used for elementary school students out of that fund. But we can shift it over, if the state allows us to take the monies out of at-risk, shift it over to our general fund and pay for it out of there. So it ends up in the same end result. So this shows 700 or so thousand being shifted from at-risk to the general fund. The rest is aid to district money that's helping us balance the budget in this proposed version, again, pending whatever discussions the board has. So that's the revenue. It's summarized. As you look at the expenditures budget, it's going to be about 2 pages long, but it's stream summarization. We have thousands of accounts that we're required to utilize, so we have to show things summarized there too, to give a clear picture. Again, it includes the must items, the staff, retirement, the health insurance, that 26 teacher staff that we talked about. I mentioned the lowered pupil teacher ratios in first, fourth, and fifth, removal of the charter school allocation, the one item that I haven't mentioned to this point, and it was a request and we saw a significant need there, was that we have high school counselors that are 190 days, and there was a request to increase them to 200 days next year. Right now, they're leaving right after students, and it's not allowing a lot of time for year-end closeout of students' records and those things. There wasn't a significant cost there. It was about $50,000 overall, and we saw that as a significant need that we built into the budget here. We have the ABM project that we're financing over a number of years. That debt service number increased, so we had to increase that line item. We bumped up the energy budget for next year, and you'll see that in a second. We have after school, we have summer school programs, you have rates that are increasing, we have HEPA filtration systems that are going to be in classrooms, we have airflow that is more continuous than maybe it had been in the past because of COVID. All of those things are going to impact the energy budget, and we bumped that up some. There are other little changes, but compared to some other years, there aren't a whole lot of additional items in there outside of the must items. One thing not listed that is worth mentioning, the board's historically added $25 to the teacher supply checks. The state has funded $275. The board's pitched in $25 to make it an even $300. We still have that in the budget too. Again, a draft version of the expenditures budget. These are thousands of accounts that are summarized. I'll point out a few here, and you'll probably have to look on your copy, but regular salaries is up. That reflects a mid-year step increase that we haven't adjusted yet in the 2021 number. So you have the mid-year step increase for 2021. You have next year's increase of a step, the 26th step on the teacher scale, and all of that netted against all the other changes. Throughout the budget process and the planning and the behind the scenes, we're constantly tracking changes. Whenever we know that there's going to be a departure next year, somebody submitted a resignation, we're updating those records. Whenever there's a new hire, whenever we know there's a vacancy that we don't have someone for, we're constantly updating that, and that's reflected here. That overtime and extra duty line item is down significantly. That reflects the Christmas and loyalty bonus this year. We had some additional funds that were added into the budget for maintenance department overtime to help cover those costs early in the year whenever we were cleaning classrooms regularly, after hours, weekends, etc. So that was pulled out. The fringe line item is largely tied to retirement. I gave the example about how much retirement could go up even if salaries didn't increase. So that's reflected. There are a variety of other changes here. One I did want to point out, you'll see a $60,000 increase here. We anticipate a need for a demographics study maybe late next year as we have some new facilities in the North Augusta area that are going to be developed. We wanted to put some funds in the budget for that. A couple of these items are more of a shift between accounts, like this reduction here, 400,000, and this increase of 300,000. We had 400,000 shift line items at the request of the technology department. That's also netted against some other reductions on this line item. The custodial supplies budget, it shows that it's down 100,000. We added 100,000 mid-year for COVID-related supplies, but we're covering some of those items out of the ESSER $2 that the board approved a few weeks back. So we're pulling that 100,000 off. Again, you see the estimated increase in the energy budget and the debt service budget. There's the removal of the charter school payment. And I tried to put some footnotes. It's not all inclusive, but we wanted to provide some overview of what those changes were. So we've talked about what's in this proposed version of the budget, pending any changes, but we also wanted to share those budget requests that we received. In January, we asked departments, we asked schools, programs to submit their budget request. It's a pretty simple budget survey. And we take those and evaluate what the costs are. Most everything on there has some merit, but may not be the highest priority. There are some things that just aren't a fit for the budget. There are some items that we were able to address in the ESSER II plan that were budget requests that aren't listed here because we were able to address those with other funds. The 6 positions for Ed Tech, the 21 early interventionist positions at the elementary schools were 2 high priority items that we were able to address with those funds and pay for at least for 2 years and avoid those costs in Fund 1. Other high priority items that aren't in the budget at this time that we wanted to share, and this is based on senior staff's review of this and our prioritization, keeping the current budget landscape in mind too, was bonus pay for teachers in that pay band. We discussed it with the mid-year step, and I showed earlier, a teacher going from step 0 to 1, if there's no cost of living adjustment, or from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3, wouldn't see an increase in their paycheck necessarily. That's something that the board has historically done when there hasn't been a cost of living adjustment. We had a request for additional elementary counselors. We had a report on counselors, I think about 2 months ago now, and there were some questions that came up about it. I mentioned earlier we added 10 days to the 190-day high school counselors, but there was also a request for additional staffing at those larger schools for elementary. Funding for 2 preventative maintenance mechanics for the maintenance department. We have significant needs there. We have HVAC systems, filters, HEPA systems, etc., and could use the additional help. And then this last item for technology curriculum specialists. It's listed here because it didn't make it into the original ESSER 2 plan. If it ultimately is adopted in ESSER 2 funding, of course, that will come off of the list. I don't want it to be confused with we're asking for a second one. It's one or the other. Preferably ESSER 2 is the priority there. On each of these, I provided a little narrative, I think, in your purple folder, and we have some cost estimates there. Funding for media center upgrades, we've had a request for increases in the library supplies budget. We've had increases, it's more of a 3-part request for athletics from athletic directors. One is to increase the number of athletic supplements, adding assistant coaches at the high level, mostly for baseball, basketball, softball, etc. We have that breakdown in there. Schools have also asked for supplemental funding for the athletic programs. They were hit hard this year by COVID. Had a request for some startup funding and to help fill that gap that they dealt with this year. Schools have asked for increased school supplies budgets. We tie those to enrollment numbers and pay a variety of supplies budgets based on X amount. And so we have an estimate in there for what the cost would be if there were, and it wasn't quite arbitrary, but I said a $4 increase at about 22,000 students and change, so about 90,000 there. Request for an employee assistance program in HR, request for a fine arts coordinator under instructional services, and a request for world language coordinator under instructional services. Those were the medium priority items. Those items, and again, not without merit, but based on the budget landscape that senior staff identified as a lower priority, because we had to prioritize things, were the funding for band equipment repairs and replacement. This board approved recurring fine arts funding 3 years ago for each level. 3 years ago, high schools received that, and they've received $165,000 allocated based on enrollment for the years since. 2 years ago, middle schools got it, and I guess this year, elementary schools received. So we think that there's funding there for schools. It's to be used for fine arts funding. It's at the principal's discretion in their assessment of their needs at the school. That's why this was considered a lower priority. Increasing the athletic coaching supplements, we have, this is not the number of supplements, this is the dollar value of supplements. We have some estimates in your packet. Schools have asked for budgets for furniture replacements for years. That would be a school level budget. I think prior to my time, schools probably had that and they went by the wayside and never have returned. We've been able to address some through construction or 8% monies, or if schools have some available funds late in the school year for maybe an office supplies budget that isn't going to be utilized, they may utilize that for some small scale furniture replacements. We have a request for increased school travel budgets, creation of an assistant executive supervisor position. That's position, not plural. I apologize for that. I just called it position for transportation. Transportation asked for an increased budget for repairs and maintenance. There was a request for additional support staff for the Office of Accountability and Assessment and for an additional staff member in communications. So we've shared that we right now have a proposed first reading that would be balanced, depending on how some talks may go here shortly, but at this point, there isn't a lot of wiggle room that we have had in some other years, unless we made some other decisions. We've largely stayed away from fund balance over the years. We have hit it typically after audit results from to address some non-recurring, some one-time type items. That may be an option. There may be some things on this list too that on the previous pages that could be done later on in the year. We amend budgets regularly, so that's always a possibility too that I probably should have mentioned here. We'll continue to look at ways to reduce expenditures here in coming weeks. We continually look to see if there are ways that we could repurpose things. There was one item on the list that we removed from a preliminary version that went out Friday because we were able to shift things between a couple of other budgets under Mr. Lawrence's budget and under the HR budget to address items. So we repurposed some things and pulled it off. We also, and this isn't Trey advocated in any way, I'm sharing info here, but we have the option to increase property taxes. We have a current year cap that the state says, and we have this 3-year look back that's available to us. Years ago, the state said you get your current year cap, and if you increase taxes up to the max, that's great. If you don't increase taxes at all and you go to the next year, it's tough luck. You can't say, yeah, well, I didn't do it last year, I want to do it this year. Well, legislation was passed that allowed a 3-year look back on that. So districts do have the ability to go back and recapture past tax increases that it decided to forego. One last note on fund balance, and I didn't include a slide here on it, but I'm projecting that we'll probably be about between 2 3/4 months and 3 months worth of reserves. Whenever we finish this year, we've still got a little ways to go, but I think we will take a little bit of a hit again because of things that we didn't anticipate. drop in enrollment, the impact that it had on our revenue, that we are able to better plan for next year, but that's where I anticipate fund balance finishing for this next year. We do get asked periodically, what's fund balance? And it's tough to say at any point in time what it is as of today, because if you could visualize, and if I would have been wise enough to put a slide in here, it'd show up better. But we have expenditures that are pretty level throughout the year. Well, we start out the year where revenues aren't as high. And then we get mid-year, property tax monies come in, and our revenue shoots up for the year, and things tend to balance out. So we hit points during the fall where we don't have a whole lot of money, where our fund balance has been utilized for cash flows. It's floated us years ago when we didn't have a very strong fund balance. We had to issue TANs, temporary financing, really just to give us necessary cash flows in October, November, early December every year. We haven't had to do that in a long time, but that's the importance of fund balance too. But it does change throughout the year, and then we have that final audited balance every year. So next steps, we'll update anything that we need to coming out of tonight's discussions. We'll get that on the agenda for next week. We'll have a first reading. We'll continue to track the state budget process. We'll continue to update things, especially monitoring the Senate version, and then if there are differences in the Senate and House, how they come back and compromise and what the end result is there. Here in the next couple of weeks, within 2 weeks, we'll have to advertise the budget in the newspaper in preparation of the budget hearing. And that first meeting in May, folks will have the opportunity to speak to our budget if there are concerns there. I'll be happy to answer any questions or go back to slides.
Anybody have a question? Start now.
Yeah. Thank you for going through that with us. And it was on the slide, but I just want to double check. The budget that's proposed does not include any of those other additional items, even if they're the high, medium, low priority.
That's correct.
So I'm just saying, even the high ones are not included in that budget.
That's correct.
Okay. The next thing, maybe we're going to talk about the budget a couple more times. One thing that would be good to have between now and then on the preventive maintenance mechanics. The first thing that came to mind is what's our maintenance backlog in terms of weeks or whatever, given the amount of people that we have now, and kind of what's our target. And then I read in the addendum that we got today, and I apologize, I didn't see it until it was sent to us today. In that kind of addendum, it said that one of the reasons for those positions was to change out HEPA filters and filters on HVACs and things like that. And I don't need it now, but just, my simple mind guy that, runs this, owns a house. I'm not entirely sure why you have to send a maintenance tech out to do that. So any explanation would be great.
Yes, we'll be happy to do that. I apologize, the addendum, the narrative that went out today, I didn't finalize until late today, so I think Mr. Lawrence got that as soon as he could.
No, that's fine. And the last thing's out of curiosity, and I'll look at you, Mr. Lawrence, is just looking at all that, the almost 48, 49 allocations we're projecting to lose. God, I've been around long enough. That's beyond the normal variation, right? That's significant. Or is that kind of, I'm just not sure how the normal churn is. And then the follow-up to that is, about when during the year does it kind of all shake out as from attrition and so forth?
Yeah, that is unusual.
Okay.
We typically, maintain the number of FTEs that we have, from one year to the next. It may go up a little, it may go down a little, but last several years, it's kind of grown from year to year, maybe just by, 2 or 3 teachers, but it has typically grown. The huge drop in enrollment that we have, and we haven't been able to recoup that enrollment, and don't see where those students would be back in August. So that's where the majority of that reduction comes from.
As, if I might add, I think we've had summers where we've hired 150 teachers or 175 or maybe even 200 a couple of years ago. So that's, there is attrition and vacancies out there that allow us to absorb that.
Yeah, that's, about when does that kind of shake out where we know how many people we have to hire and so forth? 'Cause I wouldn't ask.
Yeah, we know a lot right now,
Okay.
and Jennifer, Ms. Hart may want to follow up on this, but when contracts go out, at the end of this month, and then when they have to be in, I think by the 10th of May, we'll know exactly how many people aren't coming back, and we'll be able to make shifts within our schools and between schools as necessary. But we know we'll still have to hire teachers. We know we're gonna hire, we're gonna need 150 teachers, and so losing 40 or 50, we'll still have to fill in. Ms. Hart, if you want.
Correct, yeah. We're currently working through all of those necessary shifts, working with principals and with teachers. So if at one particular school, we have 5 fifth grade teachers and they need 4 fifth grade teachers, working with them to make those adjustments. We do typically replace more teachers than we're anticipating to lose in those allocations, based on retirement, normal attrition, relocations, internal promotions. And again, just as he said, contracts will go out at the end of this month. They have to be returned under state law by May 10th. And at that point, we'll have a much clearer idea.
Thank you.
One other little thing, Kevin.
Go ahead. Mr. Smith.
11-day camp. Will help shake that out too, what you're talking about.
Yeah, so. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Mr. Smith, we monitor very, very closely from the first day of school through the 11th day, and although it's sometimes painful, and we really try to avoid it as much as possible, we can make some minor shifts between schools during those first couple of weeks.
Anybody else with questions? Can we hire things like maintenance mechanics out of COVID funds if their the total time is spent maintaining or doing the
That's-
things that are necessary?
I think it would, the record keeping part of it, I think is difficult because those SR2 funds have to be, it's for preventing, combating, reacting to COVID. So
But certainly they could change the filters on all these.
it would almost have to be a constant. They're gonna have to keep a separate set of timesheets for everything. I think there would be significant difficulty doing that, to say that they haven't been pulled off to move furniture, which may happen sometimes, or there's another absence over here. It'd be almost a constant tracking of their time. That's knowing that there was a need, and we did discuss that earlier, but I just foresee a tracking nightmare there.
I agree, unless there's enough of that kind of work to do to devote it to full-time, and that becomes their job description, and they don't do anything else.
Yes, right.
But I understand.
And having the ability to support that if we're audited. And that's something we want to be mindful of throughout as well.
Well, I'm going to, okay, Mr. Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Traxler. As always, I appreciate all the detail. This is very early, just the Senate just started today. Is there any feel that they're gonna do anything drastically different from the House at this point? Have we gotten any guidance from SCASBA or anybody?
No, sir. It's, I'm sure it's, once there may be a field, we'll get an update. I think the BEA, Board of Economic Advisors, meets later this month. So the difficulty may be, there may be a faster way to go back, so I'm going all the way back. Difficulty may just be the timing of things, when that meeting takes place in relation to this, how soon that info may be available. How cautious is the state going to be with COVID? How optimistic are things with the vaccinations and those kind of things and revenue projections? But I think a lot of it's going to be based on that meeting, whenever it is. It may even be early May. There was a meeting in February, and I think the revenue projections for the state, they decided to hold them steady, not revise those. So I don't know how much info is going to be available. But we should have an update from SCASBO and I'm sure other groups Monday, so hopefully we'll have some news next week that we can share, one way or the other.
If we have something, whatever we have, if we have anything, that certainly helped me. Again, I appreciate all that. I'll just speak for myself here. It'd be great if the state would start funding us to the level at which they're legally required to. $14 million gap, that's a pretty big deal. We just recently had a pretty big state abundance. I don't know if that's the case anymore, but they weren't too generous during that period. I don't know if they're gonna change that now, but that's just my personal take on it. I appreciate that. It doesn't have anything to do with that. Just a little commentary. Thank you.
So there's no wiggle room, as you say, in the budget for these high, medium, and low priority items. So, and I don't mean this in a negative way at all. I'm just trying to understand, what's the reasoning for listing those? Is there a point in time in the future where it may come into play and we should have some discussion now about it, or in the upcoming meetings about that? Or how does that tie into?
Yeah, sir, we wanted you to be aware of the requests that the various departments and schools had made for the budget. And also, you do have some options that Mr. Traxler just put up there. Fund balance is one. There are a number of things in there that could be considered one-time expenses, which it would be reasonable to use a portion of fund balance for. One of those might be making some improvements to media centers. One might be filling in some of those gaps for the athletic programs because of the shortened and canceled seasons that we had. So those are just a couple of the examples of one-time, non-recurring items that you could choose as a board to use that for. I'm gonna whisper that last one, but you could pick some things out of that list and choose to increase property taxes and fund. And also, we're gonna keep looking at ways, there could be additional revenues that come from the state. We could see some places, although I can't imagine huge amounts of money being found by looking at shifts within the budget, but it's certainly possible that some things could be repurposed somewhere to address a few of those things.
Okay, because, I mean, maybe it's not worth the effort now, because we've had some side conversations about the athletic funding and increasing supplements to be a little more competitive, I should say, with surrounding areas and even neighboring Edgefield for that matter. You've taken the liberty as a senior staff to prioritize something, maybe those three things that athletic directors came back with, and I might be interested to go back and say, well, if it was an either-or situation, would it be better use of the money to increase those supplements and close that gap a little bit, rather than add all these assistants? In other words, the purpose of all those assistants, maybe they're not the same for every school, the need for additional assistance. Give them some flexibility, say, okay, well, maybe this program or that program, because of some liability issues, we need to look at assistant. But I guess what I'm saying is, if it ever comes to a point where we can make some decisions there on recurring, what's their feeling for prioritizing those three things they came back with?
And so when they presented it, it was a package, but we can certainly ask them to reconvene and let us know if, which of those items that they presented, how would they prioritize them? I think that would be.
If we have that opportunity to address.
Yes, sir, we can have that for you next week.
Well, since so many suppositions, I mean, the budget builds on a lot of suppositions, I think personally that it would be wise to prioritize those items. In the event that we guess wrong, or we have an increase in enrollment, or we end up with more money than we think we're gonna have, we wouldn't have to go back and reinvent the wheel. We could go ahead and have a list of add-ons in priority order in the event that additional funds are discovered. That's just my recommendation. Mr. Crane.
I apologize, I should have asked this a minute ago. Mr. Traxler, I didn't see it in here, maybe it's in here and I just overlooked it. What is current fund balance right now that we're talking about?
Was
Approximately.
say low 50s.
And what are we required to have?
We're required to have 1 month. We're required to have 1 month per the state in order to avoid any sanctions. So monitoring, be identified in a fiscal wise or fiscal emergency, things of that nature. It 1 month puts us in a dangerous spot. Our policy outlines that we want to have an absolute floor of 1 month, but a desire to have at least 2 months. But yeah, fund balance is 150, somewhere in there.
What's your goal for fund balance? How many months do you like?
I think that 3 months is a good level to be at because, and this is my take, in any year that we do have a significant hit, let's say that, and we have faced years like this where we took a $7 or $8 or $9 million hit to fund balance and we cut everything possible because at the time of that mid-year cut, our fund balance was already low. It wasn't sufficient by our current standards. But that does gives us room to absorb any mid-year cuts that we weren't able to handle through normal reductions. It provides the cash flows that we need. It provides some options for emergency items, for one-time items that the board has approved from time to time over the years. So that's my thought on it. Maybe worth some additional discussion. I would say at an absolute minimum 2 months, but I think 3 is more ideal.
We've seen that the increase in fund balance over the years by this school district have a very positive impact on its debt rating and those kinds of things.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes, sir, and I failed to mention that, and I shouldn't have. It it has a significant impact because that's one of the things that gets looked at. Every year whenever we issue our 8% bonds, we have calls with bond rating agencies and they ask, what's your fund balance? Are you hitting it? Did you use it, balance the budget? Are you hitting it for recurring items? So and we receive a letter and it mentions ways that things that may improve your credit rating, and one of those is continuing to build fund balance. They've commented on the board's proactiveness to do certain things and the district's fiscal policies, but that's one of them that they've noted that could help contribute to our credit ratings.
Thank you. Mr. Nussle, did you have a hand up?
Yes, sir. So maybe just for some color the next time we meet, back in 2008, when you first got here, that's when we furloughed teachers and we stopped hiring and took a lot of austerity measures because of the big cut in funding that we saw on that chart. And I just, fund balance is good for those times as well, I would think. And I would just, the next time we meet, it'd be good to have an opinion of what kind of fund balance. That's kind of an extreme situation. But if you got put in a situation like that, how could you maintain the school year you had planned? And what kind of fund balance would it take to do that if you chose to?
Well, I was here then. I think that's probably when I started to grade and started getting a little thin up there. But it was a tough stretch. Our fund balance, we were less than a month's worth of reserves at that stretch. And we did have to, we furloughed teachers 5 days. The state said, and whatever you do for teachers, you have to do twice as many days for non-teachers. We weren't giving step increases to non-teachers. In the teachers' case, we gave them a step, but then we turned around and had to furlough. So lots of cuts, drastic cuts during that stretch because we didn't have fund balance to fall back on. But yes, sir, we could provide some info there.
Dr. Hanks?
Just a quick question to Traxler. The funding based on student enrollment, we have a decline, but what is that actual number? Do you have that, or percentage change, or?
I know that we're down, I think about 1,000 plus students whenever you take out charter schools, take those out of consideration. I'll grab that exact number for you and provide it. Probably the easiest thing, I could provide the 45th day numbers for last year compared to this year. I think that may be the best illustration.
Anybody else? I have a question that I'd like to ask. If I could get you to go back to the pupil-teacher ratio chart page.
Yes.
All right. You see that the recommendation, what's in the budget is the reduction of first grade and fourth and fifth grade. And the logic for that, I understand Mr. Lawrence's logic, or the staff's logic, whoever came up with it. But it's, the problem I have is with the philosophical underpinning. What I think the purpose here is to put more equity into the distribution of teachers and pupil-teacher ratio. My passion is to reduce the pupil-teacher ratio in the first 3 grades, kindergarten in the first 3 grades. Because I believe that if the kids don't get it in the first and second grades, the overcoming that are pretty slim. So it's a little philosophical difference that I want to get the board to think about. You know, do we want, I'm all for reducing the pupil teacher ratio, but do we want to go for equity, or do we want to go for early impact? And that's a question I ask, we don't have to answer tonight, we'll have an opportunity a week from tonight to review these things.
Mr. Chair, I would like to point out that it is a two-year, two-step process. So, the goal is at the end of the second year to also bring, second and third grade and kindergarten numbers down as well. So of the 6 grade levels in elementary school, we would be bringing all of them down over the course of 2 years.
I understand. Where I'm coming from on this is research that I'm familiar with indicates that pupil teacher ratio really starts to make a difference around 15, 14. And if you go back to our experience with hybrid this year, how many times did I have a teacher call me up and tell me how much more their children were learning, how much better they could teach, all those things because of the reduced number in their classes. Now, we're not going to accomplish what we need to accomplish in our term, probably. But what I really think we should shoot for is to get these first, second, third graders down into 10, 12, 13 numbers. And then I think we could really sincerely make an attempt to address the achievement gap that we see between poor kids and the kids who have a better, more fluent home life. I think it's going to take something really drastic. I mean, I've been hearing about the achievement gap for 50 years, and it hasn't really changed much. And we're going to have to do something different. Just think about it. We'll talk about it next week. Anything else? If not, if there are no further questions, we need an executive session. I will entertain a motion to go into executive session for the purposes of considering a property matter. We also have to, in executive session, deal with the employment of the administrator and to get a legal briefing on a bond petition. So, is there a motion to go into executive session?
Make a motion.
Moved by Mr. Smith, seconded by Ms. Ryan Jackson. All in favor? That's everyone. We will go into executive session. Let's try to be ready to go at the court of appeal. And then we will reconvene to vote on anything that needs to be voted on. Okay, while in executive session, the board received some legal advice and discussed the property issue confronting the board. No action. We do need a motion. No, on this item, we do not need a motion. We received legal advice on a piece of property that we have for sale, and we do need a motion on that.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board authorize administration to work with the offerers who have proposed a contract basis for the purchase of school property after a prior contract had expired by its terms. If the administration can work out the details along the lines discussed, or better, with the offerers LOI, outlining the basis for opening the negotiations, then I move to authorize further the chair and superintendent to execute a sales contract on behalf of the district for this property after such details have been reduced to contract.
Is there a second? Second by Mr. Smith. Any discussion? If not, all in favor, please raise your hand. That's everyone. You know. We also received a recommendation for the employment of an assistant principal at A.O. Corbin. Is there a motion?
I so move as the personnel recommended.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the recommendation of administration.
I second the motion.
Ms. Sheedy seconds the motion. Any discussion? All in favor, please raise your hand. That's everyone, as you know. Chair will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Moved by Mr. Smith, seconded by Mr. Crane. All in favor, please raise your hand. Meeting is